Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Cuddy, the Marilyn Thoma Artistic Director at the Chicago Humanities Festival, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming you to this program with Claudia Rankine around her new book, Just Us, An American Conversation. This annual program is presented in honor of Esther S. and her 90th birthday, and it's in celebration of her lifetime commitment to culture, curiosity, and social justice. And Esther, I just want to say directly to you, one of my favorite experiences during the festival is seeing you in the audience. And though we cannot meet in person this year, I'm so glad you're once again helping to make our fall season possible. So thank you so much. If you are new to CHF, get to know us. You can learn more about our partners and our upcoming events at chicagohumanities.org. This program and many others are coming to you entirely free throughout our fall season. We encourage you to lend your support if possible. You can make a donation or become a member. You can also learn more about our commitment to accessibility there. Thanks to support from CHF audiences, all of our digital events have closed captioning, which can be activated in YouTube. And tonight we also have an ASL interpreter. So thank you so much to our captioner and our interpreter this evening. Thanks also to our partner on this program, Leadership Greater Chicago. If there are any fellows from LGC in the house, please raise your hand in the YouTube chat stream. We welcome you here. And we've really been looking forward to welcoming Claudia Rankine back to CHF. She was last with us in 2015 around the publication of her book, Citizen. We had an amazing couple of programs with her, and I'm thrilled that she is here to talk about her new book, Just Us. And I'm equally thrilled that she will be in conversation with the writer Eula Biss. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Eula Biss and Claudia Rankine.
Thanks so much, Allison. And Claudia, it's such an honor to be here with you tonight. I'm so delighted to be talking with you. Your book, I'm going to hold up. It's got a real formidable weight to it, literally and metaphorically, and it's subtitled An American Conversation. So let's begin our conversation by talking about conversation. You write about a phrase used by a friend, reciprocation of understanding, and you ask if that's what we're after in conversation. Then you consider another friend's phrase, entangled empathy. And then you go on to suggest that maybe a conversation is our attempt to be in relation. And I was drawn to this proposal that a conversation like an essay is an attempt, an effort, a trial. This idea foregrounds the possibility that not every attempt will work out or go as planned or be satisfying. So could you talk a bit about engaging in and writing from what you call the complicated mess of true conversation? Well, you're muted.
Oh, yeah, there we are. It's so great to see you. I'm always so happy when we get to spend a little time together. This book, I should say, Just Us, An American Conversation, started with the proposal to approach white men in liminal spaces and talk to them about white male privilege. And at the time, I thought, what is a conversation? If I want to have a conversation, what is it I'm after? What do I want to build in the space between me and that other person? And so I began to think a lot about the encounter, whether they're intimate ones or impersonal ones with strangers. What do we want from that? And, the book then became a way to really think about the conversation as its own thing. Like an object that you turn around, and each essay, I think, approaches it differently because the other, the person, your interlocutor, because they're different, each time the thing gets built differently. So sometimes it's an entanglement, historically, and sometimes it's an entanglement personally. Other times it's a thwarted attempt, you know. So I wanted people, there's a way in which Just Us is an experimental text about process. And I wanted people to really consciously think about what they want when they are in conversation with another.
One of the things the book invited me to think about was the difference between small talk and conversation. And there's all these wonderful moments where you take what is starting out as small talk and you ask it to be, or invite it to be, conversation. And it made me think about how where small talk is predictable and comfortable, conversation is unpredictable, and at its best, it invites these opportunities for the narrative to be upended, for either person's narrative to be upended. And I'm wondering if we could talk about that a little bit, about narrative. You write about white people's attachment to narratives of their own moral goodness, as in, I'll just pluck one out of the ether. I'm a basically good person who has worked hard for everything I have, is a common narrative that white people are attached to. These are the stories we tell ourselves in order to live, and to live comfortably. And you write, white people don't really want change if it means they need to think differently than they do about who they are. We talk about the challenge of inviting someone, particularly a white someone, into a different narrative.
Well, I think that's probably true about everybody. None of us want change if we have to really think differently about who we are. But I think with white people, it's especially interesting to me because it actually affects my ability to live my life. Their commitment to a certain narrative disallows a certain mobility within my own life. So that's why I'm especially interested in the narratives that white people connect themselves to. And often that sense of white benevolence that allows racism to exist without white people. That sense that things happen and we can name them racist, but there are no white people attached to them at all, not institutionally and not personally. And so I in this book, I wanted to bring the reality back to the narrative, like the whole reality, the complex reality that we are all entangled in and working our way through as we encounter each other. And sometimes that encounter means that a white person sort of is able to stop you and then be ignorant around the ways in which they're stopping you. And what happens when you then bring that to their attention? When you push the moment to its crisis, what's the next step? And I think Just Us is trying to kind of lay bare the possible next steps.
And you do illustrate a number of possible consequences for that. Different things happen in different conversations. Different people react differently to that challenge that you present. And sometimes the conversation is shut down. Sometimes you're disappointed. Sometimes you're infuriated. And sometimes there's a shift in someone's thinking. And sometimes that shift in thinking takes a long time. You'll get a note from someone long after you had the conversation. And that made me think about how conversation acts on me. I feel like I rarely have the spontaneity to rise to the demands of a especially challenging conversation when I'm in it, but it stays in my mind and it acts on me for a long time afterwards. And I guess that's one of it seems to me that there can be a conversation that might feel like it didn't do anything that actually does something. And in that way, I guess it's like teaching, right? We have to know as teachers that sometimes it's going to be years before what we have to offer gets appreciated. So what you were saying reminded me of, I wanted to talk about property and things that we don't maybe conventionally think of as property, but the way you were talking about narrative just now is suggestive of narrative as property and as a kind of prized property and as a protected property that the person who's attached to that narrative or that property doesn't want to give it up, and will guard it like private property is guarded. And you write about, you quote from Whiteness as Property by Cheryl Harris, and she writes, "The set of assumptions, privileges, and benefits that accompany the status of being white have become a valuable asset." And you go on to talk about how that asset, the protection of that asset has real consequences in terms of how laws are interpreted, for instance. And so that stand your ground laws are essentially treating assumptions and fears and personal narratives as property that we are allowed to protect at the expense of someone else's life. Can you speak to that, say more about that, mess around in that area?
Sure. One thing I wanted to say though, before we go there, is the idea of small talk as being comfortable. You know, I often find small talk is uncomfortable.
Me too.
It feels like it takes a lot of effort to stay in this neutral, unimportant place where I feel beleaguered in a certain way. So I just wanted to put that out there.
And I never feel like I'm doing it right. I get very stressed by small talk because I feel like I'm screwing it up. And either I'm saying something I don't believe to be true because I'm trying to create the comfort that I believe small talk is intended to create, and that makes me uncomfortable, or I just can't find the things to say that are supposed to be said. And I like you feel like I relax when things get a little deeper, more unpredictable, trickier. And then I feel like, oh, okay, now we're doing something.
Yeah, now you're interesting me. You know, like now I'm interested, as opposed to waiting for an out where I can return to my book or, you know, step out the door. But in terms of property, you know, property is a huge thing, given that white people began thinking about Black people as property. And so when you open up that arena of how property has worked in the American landscape, it's intense, you know, because you have these people that who thought they could take other human beings and make them into property, who could take away, I mean, you know, if you think about the United States as a colonized space, I was just talking to Viet about this recently, and if, you know, Europeans came over here, colonized the space, brought slaves, committed genocide against the Native Americans and took all that property and then made the human beings into property. And then white men, 1790 Immigration Act, the only person who can vote is a white man who owns property and is white Anglo-Saxon male, you know? And then you have this whole long history of people are trying to get into that equation, like who gets to get the property, who gets to control the vote. And you know, right now we're in a really interesting moment with the electoral college as a way of controlling that vote in terms of the space of the United States being divided up in such a way that these, you know, should I say Republicans? I'll say Republicans can then use the electoral college on their behalf rather than each person having their own vote, one person. But in the book, the place I think that property is really looked at is in the essay called Big Little Lies, in which I'm having a conversation with a friend of mine who comes from the lineage of white Anglo-Saxon and can, you know, locate her family members on the Mayflower, et cetera, et cetera. And we are in a position now where our lives look similar. And so I'm thinking about the show. I don't know if have you seen Big Little Lies? You don't watch a lot of television?
On TV.
But in that show, it's a bunch of very wealthy white people and not so wealthy white people. There's one Black woman married to a white man as a second marriage. But they all have, you know, the ultra rich people have this beautiful house on a hill overlooking water. And then like the middle class people have this nice house, but it doesn't overlook anything. It's just like in the neighborhood. And so I say to my friend, we're like this person, the middle class person with the house that doesn't overlook anything. And in that way, we're the same. And then I realized, no, actually, we're not the same, because even though our houses look the same, you actually have two houses and you have, your economic situation is very different from my own. And your whiteness has, you know, positioned you in the world in a way that my life as an immigrant to this country, et cetera, has positioned me differently. Even though if you look at it, it looks the same. And then you have the wealth gap where for every $10 on average I have, she would have $100, you know? So I was really interested in like unraveling the story of property inside the casual comments that get made inside our conversations.
Yeah. And there's this close relationship between property and security. I pulled a quote from that essay you're talking about, Big Little Lies, where you write, her kind of security, you're speaking of this friend who lives in the similar house, her kind of security, because it's not merely monetary, is atmospheric and therefore is not transferable. It's what reigns invisible behind the term white. It doesn't inoculate her from illness, loss, or forfeiture of wealth, but it ensures a level of citizenry, safety, mobility, and belonging I can never have. And it seems to me you're describing with incredible precision there the security blanket of whiteness. And I'm not sure what my question is other than that I'm admiring that. I'm admiring that moment, Claudia. I like it and I learned from it.
Well, I think one of the things I learned in working on Just Us, what I gained was the ability to write that sentence, because I think when I guess the opening essay, it's preceded by a poem, but the opening essay in Just Us is talking to white men. And often when you say to them, can you tell me how you think about white male privilege? They tell you about how hard they worked, and they hear economic privilege immediately. And so what I began to understand is that they don't understand the atmospheric benefits they get just by being white, that there's a kind of white living that it informs their economic status, but it is not their economic status. And to be able to pull those two things apart only happened after coming up against the erasure Agler narrative over and over and over again. You know, when I would say, but you're able to walk down the street without being surveilled. You're able to go into the store without someone following you around. They're still thinking, I worked really hard, I worked really hard, I worked really hard. And you're like, wait. Before, I worked really hard too, but before any of us worked really hard, you were able to walk around. You were able to actually live your life.
Yeah, and speaking of narrative as property, that seems like the narrative that is held dearest, really, that the I worked hard for what I have narrative. It's and I've been thinking about that narrative in part because it was one of the things that in the most recent book I wrote, I refused myself that narrative. So I told myself as I wrote, you're not allowed to say to yourself, I have what I have because I worked hard. And then what does this book have to look like if you're not allowed to say that to yourself? And I found it really painful, quite excruciating. And I think when that narrative falls away, I think part of what makes it so scary for people when that narrative falls away is that you have to face the probability that everything you have is unearned, and that does it destabilizes that narrative of moral goodness you were talking about, right? It makes it very difficult to imagine oneself as the essentially good, right? And
well, I don't think everything you have is unearned. I think you do earn, you probably, you know, you've worked hard, you've been working as a writer all your life. A lot of what you have, you earned. But your ability to comfortably get to the point where you could earn it, you know, that is very different from the struggles I think Black people have, just, you know, starting from the time they're in their EA high, where, you know, teachers are assuming that you're the problem in the classroom, or you're the, you know, you want to take something from them. And so I think Black people are in the world negotiating all of that, and you have the ability to exist and do the thing that you were meant to do. And sometimes that is working really hard, but at least you can just work really hard. You don't have to have two jobs trying to stay alive and work really hard.
Yeah, I guess I think what I'm trying to say by everything I have is unearned is that I think as long as we know what we know about this social structure and this system of advantages and disadvantages, if you see it and see it clearly, I think you can't honestly say to yourself that I've earned what I have. And that is, if you're white, right? With that caveat. And I think that that's part of why people don't want to really look and see see the system for what it is, and also see the way has advantaged them, because there is, in some ways, I think it's hard to separate out. Both things can be true, right? That you've been advantaged and you've worked hard, and both things, they coexist, but then they're all knit together so that it's pretty impossible to tease out what was the result of hard work and what was the result of this system of advantages. But I guess this circles back to something that I really love in your work, Claudia. It's the way in all three of these books. So this Just Us is the final book, the third book in a trilogy. All three of these books really capture an emotional experience, an emotional existence, and in different ways. And there's very different textures in each one of these books. And I feel plunged into different emotional states in each of your works. But I think what part of what I go to your work for and learn from it is I learn about the emotional experience of racism. And there's a line I wrote down. Where'd it go? It's hard to exist and also accept my lack of existence. And that really, for me, just, it drove home the hard reality of an emotional experience. And I'm curious to ask you how much you feel like your project as a writer is to capture or reproduce an emotional state, or if that is something that happens alongside your other projects as a writer.
Well, I think I'm very consciously interested in tracking emotional states. A lot. I think as a poet, the world, the lyrical world, the reason I love living in the lyrical world is that it allows you to legitimately hold emotional narratives as equal to real life narratives. Like, not that your emotions aren't real life, but as equal to a kind of linear storytelling. And so for me to be able to kind of stop and look at what is happening emotionally inside a dynamic and tease that out is what is exciting to me as a writer. I think that it allows for language to do its full work, which is not just about saying this happened and that happened, but to drop down into all the ways that feeling shapes the happening. And so these conversations could have been communicated very differently if I weren't also tracking the emotional life of myself and what I perceive is happening in the person I'm speaking with.
One of the things that has so excited me about your work since Don't Let Me Be Lonely is the way that that emotional experience and that tracking of the emotional life is in conversation with and kind of bumping up against information. And information is used in such interesting ways in all your work. And I remember reading Don't Let Me Be Lonely and being just so sparked as a writer by the notes section. And I'd never seen a notes section like that in a work of poetry. And it was so full and so extensive. And it actually, it changed forever the way I approached the notes sections in my own books and the way that I thought about how I might deal with information in my own work. And I was excited again in this work in Just Us to see you doing this really interesting thing where you're fact checking yourself on the facing page. So the meditation of the book is happening on the right hand page, and there's a simultaneous fact checking happening on the left hand page. And I wondered if you could just talk about that decision and what you were making possible with that.
Process. I was making transparency of process in a sense. I wanted the structure and the form and content to be doing the same thing, to be working together. And so how do I make apparent that in your head as you're talking, you're sort of fact checking yourself all the time? You're like, wait, was it 72% or 64%? Was that, did Eula say that? Or did, and so by splitting the page so that we have the essays happening on one side, on the recto side, and on the verso side, having not only just the fact checks, but also moments that remind me of this moment, like a tweet or a quote or an image that seems to be in associative relation to something that's being said on the other side of the page. replicated for me how the brain works, how you, even as you're sitting across from somebody, are inside your own archive constantly, thinking about, oh, it's kind of like that, or, you know, um, and so I wanted the book, one, to replicate that, and two, to allow for that, if that makes sense, so that the process would then allow you to do the same thing. Like, you don't have to sit in just the essay. You could associate out. You could bring in an example of another historical fact that you think relates to this. You could do whatever you wanted. And then you could get to the end of that essay and just shut the book. You know, you're like, I'm done with that for now. So that the book becomes an open field, an open text that allows you in to be able to wander around inside our historical history in all the ways that both the history, the facts, the science, the sociology, the images, the cultural history has contributed to the racism. You know, and helped you either be sure about this thing or unsure about that thing, or unable to move forward in this moment.
I liked the way, to me, it felt like a conversation also as I was reading. So and we're in a conversation with someone who is anticipating you a little bit. So if you hit a moment where you felt some curiosity or doubt or argument, or it's, you could see that answered on the facing page. And I really enjoyed the way that worked for me as a reader. I'm just checking the time, Claudia, to make sure that I leave us enough time for questions. I'm gonna ask one more question of my own before we go into audience questions. You quote Sarah Ahmed, who writes, "If you name the problem, you become the problem." Could you talk about this problem of becoming the problem if you name the problem?
Well, I'm trying to think of, for example, which essay would bring us closest.
Maybe the dinner party.
Social contract. That I think one of the things I wanted, and how can I put this? I didn't have any of these conversations in order to explicate some idea, but once I had the conversation and these things came up, they were allowed me to think about other things. And with the dinner party in Social Contract, it's a dinner party where there's a man who is writing a book on our sitting president, and he makes the argument that many people who voted for him thinking economically. And I said, well, why don't we give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they voted for him based on the things that he said? The wall, you know, all of the sort of kind of racist jargon against immigrants, DACA, his nationalistic identification, you know, I'm a nationalist, use that word, all of that. I was like, this is really an agenda steeped in racism. And why can't we just agree that that's what they voted for? And he kept saying, and I said, we could have seen, given this country, that he would have been elected as president. And the man said, I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not going to say who's going to be elected. I'm like, well, and this conversation got more and more heated. And then a woman across from me, who I think was his wife, said, oh, look at the brownies. They're so beautiful, the tray of brownies. but even as this was going on, I was thinking, this is a moment where I'm not allowed to get angry, even though I was getting angry, because that's the angry Black women trope. And so now that trope is put in place in order to silence me, like, don't get too heated, lady. And that white culture has taken care of me and condemned me in my emotional state before I even achieve my emotional state. It's already sort of out there as a thing not to enter or achieve. And so that sense of bringing up certain things, being too invested in insisting on them, bringing you into this category of angry Black person inside a room where that's majority white, to me is a way of thinking about Ahmed's quote, where because you bring up certain things, there are lines as to how far you can go. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what emotions are allowed for you inside those discussions, given white people's comfort. Mm-hmm. And so I was glad after the fact, even though at the dinner party I was enraged. After the fact, I was really happy for that dinner party as a way of thinking about and thinking through how those things get played out.
Mm-hmm. And I do recognize this from naming sexism and what happens when you name sexism. And I think Ahmed's writing about sexism in that essay, and it made me think of a colleague at another university who reported on a case of a professor sexually harassing a student, and then was told, why do you want to ruin this man's career? So again, it was the naming of the problem was suddenly seen as a problem in itself. And and her answer was, I don't think it was me who ruined his career. I think that wasn't my action, that was his action. But yeah, that problem is familiar to me, and it seems to go back to even the old language that used to be used, right? Like what we now call white privilege or white supremacy or white power used to be called the Negro problem, right? That was a situation where the problem was misidentified, misplaced.
Exactly, and therefore white people were allowed to drop out.
Yeah.
But I was also interested in the way in which, if you name the problem, there's already language to discount you.
Yeah.
It's like it's not just about naming the problem. It's like you cannot emotionally enter the space that naming the problem could bring you to, without being discounted as unreasonable. And this is also true, obviously, for women, but
yes.
Yeah,
what it takes to get there is then seen as angry or hysterical or irrational or any number of stereotypical attributes. Claudia, I'm going to transition because there are some questions from the audience. I'm going to transition into handing you some of those questions. I likely won't get to all of them. The first one is from Sula Kim, who asks, can white people ever see their privilege clearly? It seems part of privilege is a certain blindness to the experiences of others who do not enjoy the security blanket of whiteness.
Can they see their privilege? I think this is a question that rephrased could be, how is it they don't see their privilege? How have they managed? This is something I'm sort of quoting Robin DiAngelo, actually, where she talks about how have you managed to get your multiple degrees and not be able to understand your own privilege? your own, how whiteness functions, separate from you, the individual, but as part of you in terms of the construction of whiteness. That is willful blindness. And I'm hoping that we are at a point now where people will not use that argument as much, that, we have seen people engage in doing the actual work of anti-racism, anti-Blackness training, all of that, in order to understand how and their own whiteness allows for certain things versus other things, how their talk about broken schools and the coded languages that get used to dismiss people of color and gate off whiteness will now have a kind of transparency to them. But I think, for years, everybody's been hoping that this kind of education will actually make its way into the heads of white people. We'll see. We're certainly in a moment.
The next question is from Allison C. I'm really interested in this one. Claudia, in Just Us, you cite the poet Erica Hunt, who describes love as, quote, a close reading that helps me invent myself more in the future, end quote. What is the role of close reading in your process/work?
Well, I think the notion of close reading is what Just Us is about. And that's why I wanted Erica's idea of love being close reading to come into this world of Just Us. Because I think to begin to really know a person, you have to listen. You have to really hear what it is they're communicating to you. And sometimes that communication lives above the language in a certain way, which is why I love bringing images into my work. That it takes all your senses to actually understand where a person wants to position themselves, what they want from you, what you need from them, what gets built between the two of you. And that is not fast work, that is really the work of a kind of an attention to language, an attention to tone, an attention to silence, to all of that. And in that way, I think Just Us might not be a book for everybody, because it really is a book that asks for the slow reading of being interested in how thought works, and where you back up and where you push forward, and what happens when a moment of crisis enters into the comfort zone of company, of being with another person.
Mm-hmm. Can we talk about that, Claudia, about this notion that every book should be a book for everybody? I know both of us come from poetry, and I think it's understood if you're a poet that you're writing for a very tiny audience. So you're already kind of disabused of that notion that you're writing for everyone when you're a poet. But can you talk around some of the problems with this idea that a book
for everyone? Well, I think that books are like, they can be an acquired thing, and you can approach a book at a certain moment and not be open to it, and then 10 years later open the book and it's your book, so it's not as if any book is closed off to anyone. Mm-hmm. But I do think that people need certain things at certain time in their lives, and if you go to a book looking for another book, then the book is not going to turn into that other book. And Just Us, for me, is a book that is about process. It's not about story.
Mhm.
And or it's not a solution to anything, it's not a prescription for anything. It's a book that says, are you curious about how a thing could work? And particularly how I personally, Claudia, am navigating this arena of whiteness, given the fact that I'm a Black woman in the world. If that's not of interest to you, then the project itself fails at the get-go.
Mhm. Mhm. Years ago, many years ago, one of my first jobs out of college was I did a brief stint at a publishing company at HarperCollins, and I momentarily worked for a woman editor who had been in the business for a very long time. She was very close to retirement, and after about 5 days on the job, she was fired, and she was fired right before retirement. And she was understandably angry about this, but she took me into her office and she gave me a history of publishing as she saw it. And one of the things that she was really, and this history started with her saying, "Don't stay in this business, it'll kill you." But she went on to talk about the dangers that she saw in what she called the bestseller model, and how increasingly she was seeing, as presses got bigger and bigger, their business model was dependent on bestsellers. And she said that when she started out early in her career, there were many small houses, and each house knew its audience that it was speaking to and was able to not only provide a service for a writer who might be writing for a particular audience, but also for that audience that knew to go to that house for the work that they were looking for. And she said that this sense of a book that might be speaking to some particular part of the population or some particular audience, that was being lost, and that the thing that editors were reaching towards now was the book that they believed would please everyone, the book for everyone. And that she saw this as very damaging to literature. And that has stayed with me for many years, for 20 years, that talk that she gave me.
Well, I feel that I'm lucky because I have a press in Grey Wolf that is able to go with me where I go, and not only go, but support that in terms of, because this was not the easiest book to put together because it had so many moving parts, and everybody sort of got on board for that. So I am beyond appreciative of having landed in a publishing house that is 100% behind my projects, and also very, talk about close reading, very close to not just the text, but to the process that I'm interested in terms of the structure of the thing, the making of the book, the page quality, the image placement, all of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is a somewhat related question here that is from Verna Kale, who says, "Greetings from Penn State. One of my students asks, should any person that identifies with any race be intended to read your work in the same way?"
In the same way, no. No, I mean, I think any person can get anything from anything. Tell me one thing, that thing. But, we all bring different things to our encounters. And I think a book is a kind of encounter, a kind of conversation you have. And my best ask of Just Us, or my ambition for the book, is that it is able to open out to lines of inquiry coming from anyone and explore those lines in ways that might be fruitful. But would it be the same for everyone? I don't think so. It's not the same for me if I read a certain essay on Monday and then reread it on Thursday. It opens itself out in many different ways, given whatever context I'm in at that moment and what I've encountered earlier that day in terms of my own other reading, for example.
Mhm. And this is something I see in teaching all the time, is if I can bring a piece of literature to a classroom, and if there's 20 students, there will be 20 different ways of reading it. And initially, when I was much newer to teaching, this would really upset me because I would bring in something that I loved and I wanted everyone to love it. And that's never the experience when you're teaching a work, or very rarely do I bring up a work that I love to a classroom and have it be universally loved by every student. There's always someone who sees a problem in it that I don't see, or who reads it because of their own experience in a way that I didn't read it, and is troubled by it or dislikes it or just simply doesn't like it.
But that's also what's fun about sharing and entanglements, because you never know where another person is going to go. You never know what they're going to associate to. You never know what choice of word will come in and sort of blow open a sentence. And that to me is what close reading is about. That and I appreciate it even in these conversations where I might feel a lot of feelings, have a lot of feelings about this thing or that thing. I still am really interested in how this thing or that thing gets said, you know, and particular word uses. The essay where the white guy calls his wife stupid, I found that a really interesting, why everybody felt that was such an assault, the use of that word. You wouldn't think that that it's such a toxic word, but it did feel that way in that conversation.
Yeah, and to me, that's one of the amazing things also about teaching, is that I've had my own experience of a work changed by seeing someone else's reaction to it, or by seeing someone else's close reading of the same work and getting re-informed and returning to the work and actually experiencing it anew and in a new way. I'm looking here to these questions. Jagravi D asks, Claudia, could you talk about the change in the subtitles of your last two books, from An American Lyric to An American Conversation?
Well, Don't Let Me Be Lonely was a book that was in response both to September 11th and the presidency of George Bush. Citizen was the project of Citizen was, how do you make tangible moments that go by so quickly, aggressive racist emotion, moments that are not the shooting, but anticipate the shooting. You know, it's like the language moments of aggression that end up in the death of George Floyd, or, you know, so that it's a continuum. And in both of those books, I felt like the lyric was really the place to mine for that, the way language gets used inside of poetry, the modes of repetition, all of that helped me in those projects. In Just Us, though it has lyric elements, and there are, I think, 3 poems in the book, it was really the place of the essay, the conversation, that I was interested in. These were sentences that were, you know, being passed back and forth. And so I was sort of moving out of the arena where poetry or lyric could do its associative work, and moving into the space where a kind of descriptive, close reading, to bring our last question forward, detailed close reading in the form of the essay would do the best work of bringing these conversations to the fore. And so, so it was really about a genre switch, even as the book is highly hybrid. You know, it's full of different erasures and different poetic techniques, but at its very foundation, the essay, in as much as it gets examined, and the conversation is what was at the center of this book. And it would have felt dishonest to just, for the sake of a trilogy, call it Just Us, an American lyric, when it wasn't a lyric. It was a conversation. Hence, you have to be flexible. And so it became an American conversation.
It was a wonderful surprise to me. I've been teaching your work in essay classes for like 15 years. And I was saying, now look, this work is published as poetry. The author understands this work as poetry. I'm teaching it here as essay. And I arrived at this book and I was like, aha, essay. All right. Let me see. I think we have one more, Claudia. Michelle Kaplan asks, do you have suggestions as to how one teaches young students about the cultural silence around race when many people live in communities that completely lack diversity?
Suggestions. Well, I think, you know, I keep saying one of the things Just Us it does, but one of the things Just Us does is it pulls the full story forward of a thing, it tries to historically kind of turn it around and say, even though this part of the story wasn't told, let's bring it in and consider it. And even though this person's name was left out, let's bring it in and consider it. So I think even with younger kids, you could try a kind of counter narrative approach to teaching, where, for example, you teach them what an abolitionist is, and you show them Walt Whitman, but then you could also show them where Walt Whitman, though he didn't like slavery, really didn't like Black people either. You know, like the two things can live together. That you can read Whitman's paper where he says, I think these Black people should get out of the United States, and where he says there's no room for slavery in our, you know, and I think this is one of those things that Americans are really not that good at. How do you hold complexity? Where if you have abolitionists, they have to be good people. And if you have people who don't, who don't like Black people, they are not the abolitionists. No, in fact, they are the same people. And so I think that we could, you know how you can see, you're watching a foreign movie because the movie holds many lines of narrative at the same time, instead of like the Disney version of movies where you just have some good white guy and some bad Indian in the American version. So we could just start muddying up the waters and bringing all of the relevant lines of inquiry into one story.
Thank you, Claudia. We've hit our time. There's a few questions we didn't get to, and I apologize, but this has been really wonderful. I've so enjoyed talking with you, Claudia.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Eula.